This is the lesson video for lesson 2.04, Variation in Populations. This lesson goes over variations in populations and how that relates to evolution. And so here's kind of our overall key point. For evolution to occur, there must be variation. Okay, so variation is essential in order for evolution to occur. So in the previous lesson, we went over how evolution is a change in allele frequency, or how common an allele is in a population over time. But in order for evolution to occur, again, there must be variation for a given trait, which means if you had, for example, if we're looking at eye color, right, we want variation for that specific trait. So we want to see blue, green, and brown. Okay, so again, if we were looking at how a certain trait evolved, there must be some sort of variation from the beginning. We call this type of variation genetic variation because the genes or the alleles vary. And so you see that all around. You would see that everywhere that you go. People have different nose lengths, shoe sizes, hair color, eye color, etc. And so this is the same for all organisms. We all have different variations for different traits. But where does this variation come from in the first place? How do they actually come about? Variation often occurs because of mutations. Okay, so one really great way to understand how mutations work is by looking at antibiotic resistance. So anti meaning against, and biotic, we can think of it against life, or we usually think of it as against bacteria. Okay, so antibiotic resistance would be resisting against something that kills life. So bacteria is often killed by antibiotics, but if you have an antibiotic resistance, that means that you're not killed by these antibiotics. Okay, and this obviously would be a problem for hospitals, because hospitals try very hard to eliminate as many harmful bacteria as possible. And so if these bacteria develop a resistance towards these, then they will continue growing instead of being killed. Antibiotic resistance is a genetic trait, which means that it's found in their genes. There are genes that help them survive against certain antibiotic formulas. And so bacteria with resistance have alleles, or the versions of a trait, that gives them this ability. You can say with complete accuracy that resistance to antibiotics is an adaptation, because it allows the bacteria to live and reproduce. Remember, adaptation is always surviving and reproducing. In a population of bacteria, some bacteria will have an allele that will make them resistant to antibiotics, and some will not. Remember, this is what we call variation, right? All the bacteria that is in that population aren't the same. Some have that resistance, some do not. But where did the alleles for antibiotic resistance come from in the first place? And so how this happens is actually what we call mutations. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take a look at a video that kind of shows how antibiotic resistance can come up. So here we see just an ordinary tabletop with some bacteria, and you're going to see right here all of these different colors represents variety in the bacteria. So you see the variety, and obviously since we have that bacteria, we're going to treat it with antibacterial spray, right? Antibiotic spray, which will kill all of the bacteria except for the yellow ones. And the yellow ones continue to grow and multiply, grow and multiply until there are many of the same kind. And so what you see here is we started with variation. We had green, blue, red, but only the yellow ones were able to survive after the antibiotic spray was applied to this tabletop. And so the end result is we have the survival of only the yellow bacteria. So again, how do we get this variation? How do we have some bacteria that have the antibiotic resistance and others that do not? So the way that these variations come about is the process of mutations. So a mutation is a change in a gene or a chromosome. And remember, a chromosome is essentially wound up DNA, right? And usually you see it like in some sort of like X formation. A mutation is a spontaneous, right, which means random change in an organism's DNA structure or sequence. Sometimes mutations come about because of copying errors during DNA replication. You previously learned about proofreading abilities during DNA replication, but sometimes they're not 100% accurate, and so mutations can come about. Other times, other things can cause mutations, such as UV light from the sun, which can cause an organism's DNA to change. So an example that you probably know of this would be something like skin cancer. So skin cancer happens because of exposure to UV light that changes the DNA and then can cause the DNA to then have cancerous genes, which then causes the person to develop that skin cancer. Okay, so it can, so sometimes it can happen because of copying errors, or it can happen due to things outside of DNA replication. But the key thing is that both of these ways are going to be spontaneous or random. Because it is random, it could either be helpful, harmful, or neutral. So it's not like an organism can think, wow, this would be a great mutation to have and I would be able to survive. That's not how mutations come about. It's completely spontaneous and random. So sometimes they're helpful, harmful, or sometimes they just don't really make any difference. Remember, a mutation is a change in an organism's DNA, and that change could happen in a coding region of a gene, which means it would affect the phenotype, or we can call it the physical appearance. Okay, so it can actually affect how an organism looks. Or it can happen in the non-coding region of DNA, which wouldn't really affect any protein. Okay, so these tend to be more of the neutral mutations. Mutations that occur within genes may be harmful or helpful, or they may have no effect at all. Some mutations may generate changes in the protein produced by the gene. Because remember, if we use DNA to make RNA, and then that gets translated into protein. This is the central dogma. So what happens is if we mutate our DNA, right, there's a problem with our DNA, then there's going to be a problem with the RNA, and then there's going to be a problem with the protein. So then the wrong, or maybe not necessarily even wrong, but different protein will be made. It really only takes just one letter or one base to change for the whole entire protein to be different. And an example of this would be the sickle cell disease, right? It's only the exchange of one base for another in the gene for the blood protein hemoglobin to cause this disease. Again, so we see here, this turtle right here has obviously a mutation that causes there to be two heads instead of just one. Here we see an alligator, right? And this alligator does not have any color, right? And so this could be a harmful mutation because it's unable to camouflage. You can clearly see this alligator in its environment. And then the last one is you see this cacti, and this cacti has lots of spikes, right? We see the mutation could possibly be that instead of being in these small round shape, that it's very long, right? So these are all different types of mutations that can either help, harm, or just not even make any difference to an organism's ability to survive. Another way that we can introduce variation, right? Remember the first way that we talked about was mutation. Another way would be gene flow. Okay, and gene flow is when we actually have organisms coming into a population by migration. So remember, a population has 3 requirements, right? It's the same species, same space, and they reproduce. Okay, so if an organism leaves their population and migrates to a new population, they are now creating changes to the gene pool, and we call that gene flow. And so remember, when an organism comes from one population to the next, it's also bringing its alleles along with it, which are basically all of their versions of the genes. Okay, so now we're changing that gene pool. So when we introduce these new genes into a population, we call that gene flow. Gene flow can also occur by organisms leaving, right? So when individuals leave a population, they are changing the gene pool because they are taking their alleles along with them to their new population. So it can happen either way. Another source of variation, right? So this would be the third type, right? We have 1, 2, now we have 3. The first one was mutation. The second one was gene flow. And the third one is genetic recombination. And how this works is that we're actually switching up the genes in our homologous chromosomes. And the reason why this creates variation is because instead of just having all of your sex cells to have the same exact genes, we now have different combinations. Like for this one, we have like a little bit from the purple chromosome on the blue one and vice versa over here. And we call this genetic recombination crossing over. And the reason why we call it crossing over is because originally you have 2 homologous chromosomes. And these 2 homologous chromosomes, remember, they all have their own DNA here. So this would be an example of what you get from your mom and what you get from your dad. Okay, so let's say that these are all the genes you got from your mom and these are all the genes you got from your dad. And theoretically, in your sex cells, if there was no crossing over, then you would either give genes all from your mom or genes all from your dad for that particular chromosome. But that would only give you a certain amount of combinations, which decreases the amount of variation. And so what happens is we have this crossing over. And so this crossing over is when we have one arm of the chromosome right here cross with the other one, and so they're switching it up so that it's not just all from mom and all from dad, but it's a little bit from mom and a little bit from dad. And so again, this creates different variations in your chromosomes when you pass them on to your offspring. Okay, so genetic drift is a random change in allele frequency, right? Remember how common certain alleles are that usually leads to a loss of genetic variation. The key for genetic drift is that it's a random change. Okay, so allele frequencies, when they change, we call that evolution. But sometimes it doesn't happen from migration, mutation, or natural selection, but it simply happens because of the random nature of mating and survival. And so we call these random events genetic drift. Okay, so here's an example. Let's see, if we look at this example right here, we have different color worms. Some are brown and some are green. And we, just for simplicity's sake, let's say that there's 10 green and there are 10 brown. Okay, so 10 green worms and 10 brown worms. And let's say by random chance, 5 green worms and 1 brown worm are squished by an elephant. So we see here that we have now lost 5 green worms and 1 brown worm. And so what ends up happening is the result is that now we only have 5 green and we have 9 brown. So instead of there being equal amounts of green and brown worms, we now have more brown than green. So now the gene frequency, right, the alleles for the brown worm definitely are higher than the green one. And so again, genetic drift is a random loss or gain of genes, usually in a small population. So what ends up happening is, again, we see those worms dying, and then in the end we see more brown than green. So mutation, gene flow, and genetic recombination, they're all going to add genetic diversity to populations, right? And that's what we call variation. In any population of organisms, those mutation, gene flow, and genetic recombination will contribute to variation in the population's gene pool, or the total alleles in a population. Because of this variation, we can now introduce this concept of natural selection. Variation is really important for natural selection because you need variation in order for certain characteristics to be selected to be best fit for an environment. So let's go back to that example that we had in the last lesson of the green and the purple birds, right? We had different color feathers. Once we introduced those brown tree snakes, the alleles or genetic makeup of the population changed, right? So here we see a variation of birds, right? We have green and we also have purple, but we introduced the snake, and what happens is natural selection happens, which is when certain organisms are favored over the other because they are more fit meaning they're able to survive and reproduce more readily than the other. And so in the case of the brown tree snake, the brown tree snake was able to see and kill the purple birds, right, a lot more easily. And so they were less fit. They were not able to survive or reproduce. So what happened was the amount of green birds actually increased. So instead of seeing equal amounts of green and purple birds, we saw mostly green birds in the end. So natural selection favored the green birds rather than the purple birds. So again, natural selection acts on the variation in population, the different alleles. Natural selection is a process by which organisms with certain traits are more likely to reproduce and have offspring than organisms with different traits. It didn't mention it here, but if they're more likely to reproduce, they're more likely also to survive. Okay, survive and reproduce. So we use this term natural selection to convey that something in the environment is favoring one variation over another in a population. So natural selection acts on a population with variation. So this can happen, look in many different ways. It could be that a predator, right, someone who eats or an organism may prefer to feed on animals of one phenotype versus another, maybe because they can see one organism better than the other. Or it could be that females prefer to mate with males who have certain characteristics. So it could be like a larger horn or prettier feathers, etc. Remember, mating is important because reproducing is an important aspect of preserving your alleles. Another way that natural selection can act is if we have changes in the climate. So if it's hot or if it's cold, certain organisms will have alleles that favor that certain environment, and so they will be more likely to survive. So in this case here, we see that the giraffe has a long neck, and so because it has a long neck, it's able to eat off of high trees, so it has more of a food source, right? So the giraffes with long necks are favored. Here's another one of a bird, and obviously has a long pointy beak, which allows it to eat nectar from a flower. So natural selection is an important mechanism for evolution, and mechanism is an important word. So you don't want to say that natural selection is evolution, right? Because there's actually different mechanisms for evolution. Natural selection is just one of the ways that evolution can occur. Okay, over time, natural selection will lead to the change in allele frequency, which we considered evolution, in a population. So if we think of green skipper butterflies, right, in an immense meadow, you can, the name suggests that they're all green, but they actually exhibit a variety of color. Remember, one of the characteristics of natural selection is that there must be variation. So there's variation in colors. So a few are almost pure red, a few are almost pure blue, and then most of them are a blend of red and blue, which are shades of green. Okay, so that means we have lots of green, right? And then low amounts of blue and low amounts of red. Okay, and the population remains stable in color for generations. So we have that same makeup for a very long time. However, there's a new population of butterfly-eating birds. And these butterfly-eating birds actually see blue very well, but they don't see red very well. So that obviously means that they're going to be able to see blue butterflies, and they're going to be more likely to eat those blue butterflies. They eat some of the greenish butterflies, but rarely touch the red ones. So we see here that these butterfly-eating birds are going to target the blue ones, right, and the green ones. And so this is obviously going to change the population a lot. After a few years of this selective eating, the butterflies actually end up being mostly red. Why is that? Because they're able to survive and they're able to reproduce. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in terms by looking at some graphs. So here, this is the beginning. Remember, we have lots of green here, very little blue and very little red. This is what it looked like in the beginning. But as those birds were introduced, remember, they're targeting this blue region, right? They're eating all the birds. So we no longer see any blue birds, right? But we see mostly red birds, right? That's increasing. And even the amount of green birds are decreasing. Okay, so we're seeing a overall shift in this direction, where there's more red birds. And we see that continue to happen, where we see increase of red, decrease of blue, and a shift overall in that direction, because we also see a decrease in green. Until at the end, we see almost exclusively all red, right? And then we don't see any blue. And so this is considered an adaptation. Why? Because these red butterflies are able to survive and reproduce, right, because of their color. Okay, so it's a characteristic that helps them with that. So variation in population is really important. It's really important that there are different alleles for each characteristic. And so remember that the environment that organisms live in are actually constantly changing. It's not always going to be the same, which means that at any given time, a certain allele that wasn't maybe that profitable might end up being the most valuable allele based on the changes in the environment. And so what that means is that a high degree of diversity, which means lots of variation, if a population have lots of variation, they're more likely to survive if the environment changes. So if you look at this population of horses right here, it might not look you could see different types of horses, right? We see like dark brown, light brown, white, right? We see many different types of hair color, and that is one way that a population of horses can be diverse, but there are also other ways that it can be diverse. For example, it can have different alleles to help them resist certain diseases. So if we were to introduce some sort of virus or bacteria into the population, then the horses that have those resistance genes are able to survive and reproduce, making that a key adaptation. Whereas right now, let's say there is no virus or bacteria introduced, then it really, one is not favored over the other. So in summary, what we talked about in this lesson was really focusing on natural selection and the importance of variation in population. Remember, we can achieve genetic variation, which is really important, by mutations, right, which is random, genetic recombination, which happens during meiosis, as well as gene flow, when we have the introduction or the certain alleles being introduced or certain alleles leaving based on the direction of where organisms are going. Natural selection, and all of this really is important because natural selection hinges on that genetic variation. It acts on that genetic variation so that evolution can occur. So here's some important vocabulary that you need to know. The first is genetic variation, which is genetic diversity in a population. Mutations, which is that spontaneous or random change in an organism's DNA structure or sequence. We have gene pool, which we went over before, all the genes in all of the members of a population. We have gene flow, which is when we introduce new genes into a population when new organisms move in, or it could also be when organisms move out and we lose certain alleles. We have genetic recombination, which occurs in meiosis during crossing over. And then natural selection, the process in which the natural environment acts on individuals so that those with favorable traits survive and reproduce, right, are key: survival and reproduction, and those who do not are eliminated.